So I had this moment the other morning. I woke up and, the very first thing I did before even opening my eyes all the way was tap the screen of my smartwatch.
Oh, yeah. Going right for the sleep score.
Exactly. I was waiting for it to give me my score. And the screen lit up, and it gave me a 62.
Ouch. A 62 is rough.
Right. And the little digital ring was orange, not green, orange. And I just laid there staring at this tiny piece of plastic and glass on my wrist, and I felt this really profound, creeping sense of guilt.
It's a very specific kind of modern guilt, isn't it? Like, you didn't just sleep poorly, you failed a metric.
Yes. I felt like I had committed a moral failing.
Yeah.
Like I hadn't optimized my biology correctly or something. I actually felt judged by an inanimate object.
Which is wild when you say it out loud, but it's so common.
It is. And the wild thing is, I know I'm not alone in this. We live in a culture where we feel constantly obligated to, self-actualize, to track our habits, to be productive, to constantly grow. And if we don't, we feel this heavy, invisible shame.
Which is exactly what we are going to dissect today. Because that feeling of guilt you had looking at your watch, it isn't just in your head. It is the end result of a meticulously designed structural evolution, one that has been unfolding for over a century.
Welcome to today's deep dive into the source material. We have an absolutely mind-bending mission for you today. We are going to unravel the invisible cages of modern life.
It's going to be a fascinating journey.
We've got our hands on a really dense, fascinating stack of technical notes by Professor Hisataka Takasugi, often referred to in academic circles as Professor T.
Right. He's a prominent researcher who maps out the metaphysical architecture of human psychology.
Exactly. And his notes trace this massive hidden mutation in how we think about ourselves. So if you've ever felt exhausted by the pressure to optimize your life, this is for you.
It is a remarkable piece of analysis. Professor T traces what he calls the lineage of must thinking.
Must thinking.
Yeah. Throughout human history, the must, like the fundamental obligations placed upon a person, has constantly shifted. If you look at antiquity, the must was purely external.
Like a command from above.
Exactly. A monarch telling you to pay taxes, or a religious text dictating dietary laws. It was absolute, and it was outside of you.
Right. A king or a god saying, do this or else. It's very straightforward.
But what Professor T maps out is how that external command slowly migrated inside of us. It mutated from, say, a boss yelling orders on a factory floor into our own personal internalized guilt.
Which is where the smartwatch comes in.
Right. And then, in the final twist, how that internal guilt was extracted from our minds and externalized all over again into the algorithms, smartwatches, and corporate data structures that rule our lives today.
It is the story of how psychological concepts originally designed to completely free human beings ended up becoming the exact systems that manage and measure us.
It's a huge paradox.
It really is. So to figure out how we got from a king's decree to an orange sleep score on my wrist, we have to travel back to where this modern psychological journey started. We're going to late 19th century Vienna.
A very specific time and place.
Very. And to understand what happens next, we need to understand the medical culture of the time. What was it actually like to be a doctor or a patient in the 1890s?
Well, the medical establishment in late 19th century Europe was incredibly confident, highly physical, and strictly mechanical.
Because they were making all these massive breakthroughs, right?
Exactly. You have to remember, this was the era of massive leaps in biology and germ theory. Doctors had microscopes. They were finding the physical bacteria that caused diseases.
So they felt like they were conquering the natural world.
They did. So the prevailing medical doctrine was that every single physical symptom must have a corresponding observable physical cause in the tissue of the body.
Meaning if you have a cough, there's a problem in your lung tissue. Or if your hand is paralyzed, there's a lesion on your nerve. You can point to it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But suddenly, these brilliant, confident doctors were running into a wall. They were confronted with an epidemic of what they called hysteria.
Hysteria.
Yeah. They had patients exhibiting severe, undeniable physical symptoms. We are talking about hysterical blindness, chronic spasms, full body paralysis, or even the inability to drink water.
Wow.
But when the doctors ran their tests, checked the nerves, and looked for brain lesions, they found absolutely nothing.
I can imagine the arrogance of the Victorian medical establishment. If they couldn't see the problem under a microscope, they probably just blamed the patient, right?
Oh, they absolutely did. Because the vast majority of these patients were women, the medical establishment often dismissed them entirely. They accused them of faking it for attention, or they wrote it off as an inherent emotional defect of the female nervous system. The term hysteria itself comes from the Greek word for uterus.
So they were essentially just giving up on them.
They were. But a few physicians began to suspect there was something far more complex happening. In Paris, Jean-Martin Charcot started experimenting with hypnosis at the Salpêtrière hospital.
And Charcot proved something terrifying to the mechanical doctors, didn't he?
He really did. He proved that the mind could command the body in ways biology couldn't explain. Charcot demonstrated that under deep hypnosis, a paralyzed patient could suddenly walk.
That must have looked like magic to them.
It did. Or, conversely, he could suggest to a healthy patient under hypnosis that their arm was paralyzed and they would wake up unable to move it.
Wow.
This completely shattered the mechanical model. It proved the body was reacting to the mind, to hidden suggestions, but Charcot's method had a fatal flaw.
Right, because the symptoms would just come right back once the hypnosis wore off. Or like they would vanish and the next day the patient would go deaf instead. It was like playing a psychological game of whack-a-mole.
Exactly. Which brings a young neurologist into the picture, Sigmund Freud.
Here we go.
Freud had actually traveled to Paris to study under Charcot. He saw the power of the hidden mind, but he realized hypnosis wasn't a permanent cure. So Freud returns to Vienna, teams up with an older, highly respected physician named Joseph Breuer, and they try a different approach.
This is where we get the famous case of Anna O, right?
Yes, Bertha Pappenheim, known in the literature as Anna O. She was experiencing severe visual disturbances, paralysis, and a horrific nervous cough.
And nothing was physically wrong with her.
Nothing they could find. So instead of hypnotizing her and just ordering the symptoms to vanish, Breuer and Freud did something revolutionary. They just listened.
Just listened.
Yeah. They created an environment where she could speak completely freely without any censorship about her thoughts, her daydreams, and her memories. She herself famously dubbed it the talking cure.
So what actually happened when she just talked?
Well, they discovered that if they let her trace her thoughts back far enough, she would eventually stumble upon a deeply repressed, highly emotional memory, usually a trauma related to nursing her dying father.
Right.
And when she finally brought that hidden memory to the surface and experienced the intense emotional pain associated with it, a process they called catharsis, the physical symptom tied to that memory would vanish.
And this time, it wouldn't come back.
Exactly. It was gone for good.
By simply speaking the unspeakable, the body healed. I mean, that is staggering. And it leads Freud to formalize what is arguably one of the most disruptive ideas in human history, which is the unconscious. He develops the iceberg model.
The iceberg model is essential to Professor T's timeline of the must. Freud argued that the conscious mind, the part of you that is aware, rational, and listening to this deep dive right now, is just the tiny tip of the iceberg visible above the waterline.
Just the tip.
Right. Right below the surface is the preconscious, containing memories you can recall if you try. But submerged deep in the freezing, dark water is a massive, invisible mountain of ice. That is the unconscious.
And it's not just a passive storage unit down there.
Not at all. It is a boiling cauldron of repressed desires, childhood traumas, unacceptable sexual impulses, and aggressive instincts.
The messy stuff.
All of it. And Freud's radical claim was that this invisible underwater mass is actually what steers the ship. You think you are making rational decisions, but you are actually being driven by unconscious forces you have no direct access to.
I want to pause and just appreciate how deeply offensive this idea was to Victorian society.
Yeah.
I mean, Freud was basically walking into a room of refined, top hat-wearing gentlemen and telling them, actually, you're all just sophisticated animals driven by repressed urges you're too scared to look at.
It was incredibly offensive. Freud himself famously called this one of the 3 great insults to human narcissism.
I love that phrasing. 3 insults to human narcissism. Let's unpack that.
It's a brilliant historical contextualization by Freud. So the first insult was cosmological, Copernicus proving the Earth revolves around the sun.
Right. We were violently removed from the center of the universe and relegated to a random rock spinning in a vast void.
Exactly. Then the second insult was biological. Darwin comes along and proves we aren't the special, divinely crafted center of creation. We are just a biological accident, highly evolved primates sharing a family tree with apes.
And then Freud delivers the third and most intimate insult, the psychological one.
Yes. He proved that not only are we not the center of the universe, not only are we not the center of creation, but we are not even the masters of our own minds.
That is heavy.
The fundamental, cherished Enlightenment ideal of the rational human actor who makes logical, autonomous choices was completely undermined. You are a passenger in your own body, driven by an engine you can't even see.
To map out this engine, Freud later developed his structural model of the mind: the id, the ego, and the superego. And this is where the timeline of the modern must really takes root. I always try to visualize these three competing forces. It feels a bit like a highly dysfunctional organization.
A corporate structure is actually a very apt way to conceptualize the conflict.
Okay, let's build this out. So down in the basement, you have the id. The id is pure, unadulterated instinct. It operates entirely on the pleasure principle. I picture it as a massive, incredibly powerful, screaming toddler.
That's a great image.
Right. It wants everything right now. It wants food, it wants sex, it wants to destroy things it doesn't like. It has no concept of time, logic, or social manners. It just demands gratification.
That toddler is the source of all your psychic energy. But obviously, you can't walk into a restaurant, smash a window, and steal a steak just because you were hungry. So who steps in?
That would be the superego, sitting up in the executive penthouse. But I always struggle to define the superego properly. Is it just your conscience?
It is far more aggressive than just a gentle conscience. The superego is the internalization of every rule, every cultural expectation, and every moral mandate your parents and society ever drilled into your head from the moment you were born.
So it's like a judge.
It is the uncompromising internal auditor. This is the birth of the internal must. The superego says, I should do this, I must never do that. And its primary weapon isn't logic, its primary weapon is guilt.
Guilt.
Yes. It functions as a relentless inner judge, constantly looking for a reason to punish you for the desires of the unid.
So you have screaming toddler in the basement wanting to steal the steak, and a ruthless auditor in the penthouse threatening you with debilitating guilt if you even look at the steak. Where does that leave the ego?
The ego is you, the conscious you. It is the stressed out middle manager trapped on the middle floors operating on the reality principle.
Just trying to keep the building from burning down.
Exactly. The ego's entire job is to navigate the actual physical world while desperately trying to appease the toddler's demands without triggering the auditor's wrath. It is a state of constant, exhausting internal negotiation.
And this is the grand paradox Professor T highlights. Freud believed that mapping this out was the ultimate act of human liberation. He thought that if he could just shine a light on this dysfunctional corporate structure inside our heads, if he could make the unconscious conscious, we would be free. We wouldn't be ruled by neurotic symptoms anymore.
Freud genuinely believed the truth would set you free. But Professor T's notes point out the structural irony here. By revealing the unconscious and the superego, Freud didn't eliminate the must. He just changed its form.
I must evolved.
Right. The external mandate like obey the king vanished, but the new mandate became you must analyze yourself.
You must excavate your childhood traumas. You must understand your repressions.
Exactly. The pursuit of psychological liberation became a mandatory lifelong chore. If you were unhappy, it wasn't just bad luck. It was because you were failing to properly manage your internal boardroom.
So it's your fault.
Yes. The burden of human suffering was relocated entirely inside the individual's mind.
But having a map of your internal boardroom is only helpful if the world outside the building is stable. While Freud and his followers were busy analyzing dreams and childhood neuroses in the quiet clinics of Vienna, the outside world was completely falling apart.
The early to mid-20th century.
Exactly. 2 massive world wars completely shatter the European continent. Millions dead, whole cities leveled, the rise of totalitarianism, and a new generation of philosophers looks at this incredible devastation and realizes Freud's internal map doesn't explain any of it.
This is a crucial pivot in human thought. Freud's framework was brilliant for explaining why one specific individual developed a nervous tic because of a repressed childhood memory, but it was entirely useless for explaining the Holocaust.
Right.
It couldn't explain how millions of supposedly rational, healthy human beings could systematically participate in the slaughter of their neighbors.
Right. If the problem is just internal neurosis, how do you explain collective societal horror? This brings us to the existentialist philosophers, who essentially looked at psychoanalysis and said, this is fundamentally the wrong tool for the job.
The existentialists, led primarily by Jean-Paul Sartre in Paris, emerged from the ruins of occupied France. They had lived through the resistance, the collaboration, the moral compromises of wartime.
They saw the darkest parts of humanity up close.
They did. And when the war ended, they watched people try to avoid accountability for their actions. The dominant defense for complicity in atrocities was, well, I was just following orders, or the system was too powerful, I had no choice, Or, using Freud's logic, my unconscious drives and social conditioning compelled me to act that way.
Sartre looked at that and felt complete disgust. He realized that if you accept determinism, if you accept that human beings are just the product of their environment, their brain chemistry, or their hidden traumas, then nobody is responsible for anything.
Which is an incredibly dangerous philosophy to hold while standing in the ashes of Europe. In his notes, Professor T frames Sartre's rejection of Freud using a very specific analytical tool called the Unified Theory, or UT framework.
Okay, let's get into the UT framework.
Professor T calls this philosophical clash a layer mismatch.
Okay, I'm looking at the notes here, and it says psychoanalysis operates on the ontic and existential layers, while existentialism operates on the ontological layer. I'm going to stop you right there. What do those words actually mean for someone who doesn't have a PhD in philosophy? Because that sounds like dense academic jargon.
It is dense, but the distinction is actually very intuitive once you break it down. Think of the ontic and existential layers as the weeds.
The weeds.
Right. This is the realm of specific individual things. Freud is in the weeds. He is looking at this specific patient with this specific phobia of horses caused by this specific domineering father. It is highly individualized, dealing with one person's particular psychological makeup.
Okay, so ontic is the micro level. The specific details of my personal life.
Mm-hmm.
What is ontological?
The ontological layer is the macro level. It zooms all the way out to look at the fundamental nature of reality, the structure of society, and the inescapable conditions of being human, regardless of your personal childhood.
So big picture.
Very big picture. Sartre wasn't interested in the weeds of your specific trauma. He was looking at the ontological reality. What does it mean that humans are thrust into a universe without inherent meaning, possessing absolute freedom, and forced to make choices that impact the entire world?
So Freud is asking, why is my patient sad? And Sartre is asking, what does it mean to exist as a free agent in a broken world?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And because Sartre was operating on that macro structural level, he saw Freud's theory of the unconscious not just as scientifically flawed, but as a massive, cowardly ethical loophole.
Wow. Cowardly.
Yes. He famously attacked Freud's concept of repression, calling it a prime example of bad faith, or mauvaise foi.
The logic Sartre uses to tear down the concept of repression is just brutal. He basically says, okay, let's look at what Freud claims is happening. Freud says you experience a trauma, it is too painful for your conscious ego to handle, so you repress it. You shove it down into the dark basement of the unconscious so you don't have to look at it anymore.
That is the standard psychoanalytic model, yes.
But Sartre says, wait a minute. Think about the mechanics of that. In order for a sensor in your mind to successfully hide a thought from your consciousness, that sensor must know what the thought is. It has to look at the thought, recognize it as dangerous, and make an active decision to hide it. Therefore, the act of hiding it is, by definition, a conscious act.
It is a devastating logical critique. Sartre argues that you cannot truly hide something from yourself without simultaneously knowing what you are hiding.
It's a paradox.
Exactly. The unconscious isn't some autonomous monster acting without your permission. It is you. You are choosing to look away. You are lying to yourself, and you know you are lying to yourself.
Wait, I actually hate this idea. I want to push back on Sartre here. Because if I accept what he's saying, he is stripping away my ultimate safety blanket.
How?
Well, it is incredibly comforting to be able to blame my neuroses on my childhood. It feels good to say, look, I sabotaged my relationships because my parents had a terrible divorce, and my unconscious programming is just terrified of abandonment. It lets me off the hook. Sartre is basically telling me I have zero excuses.
You have absolutely zero excuses. Sartre famously declared that human beings are condemned to be free.
Condemned.
And notice the word choice, condemned. Freedom, in the existentialist view, is not a joyful party. It is a crushing, agonizing burden. You cannot blame God, you cannot blame your parents, you cannot blame the government, and you cannot blame your unconscious mind. You are entirely, terrifyingly responsible for every single choice you make.
Including the choice to play the victim.
Including the choice to believe you are controlled by your trauma. If you follow orders to commit an atrocity, you chose to follow them. You valued your safety over someone else's life. Own the choice. For the existentialists in a post-war world, total agonizing freedom was the only mechanism that could guarantee total accountability.
Condemned to be free. It's an incredible philosophical stance, but practically speaking, it's a nightmare. You can't run a society like that.
No, you really can't.
Imagine trying to manage a booming post-war economy, trying to rebuild factories and establish international trade, And your foundational management philosophy is telling every worker on the assembly line, you are condemned to agonizing freedom, your life has no inherent meaning, and every action you take holds the weight of the world.
It is completely unsustainable. Existentialism demanded radical responsibility, but it provided absolutely no practical tools for mass organization. You cannot scale existential dread into corporate productivity.
Which means, as the massive post-war corporate boom took off in the 1950s and 60s, the architects of the modern business world didn't turn to Sartre. They ignored the existentialists entirely.
Completely bypass them.
Instead, they looked right back at psychology. They looked at Freud's internal boardroom, and they realized something incredibly clever. If they could just hijack the superego, that internal auditor that makes you feel guilty, they wouldn't need to force people to work. People would force themselves.
This is where Professor T's analysis transitions from the clinic to the cubicle. We enter the evolution of organizational psychology and human resources.
The birth of modern HR.
Exactly. To understand how the superego is hijacked, you have to look at how businesses used to operate. In the early 20th century, you had what management theorists call Theory X.
Theory X is basically the factory floor model, right?
Yes, it is heavily based on Frederick Taylor's scientific management. Taylor famously studied men loading pig iron onto crane cars. Theory X operates on a very bleak assumption about human nature. It assumes humans are inherently lazy, they despise work, they avoid responsibility, and the only way to get them to do anything is through strict external control and the threat of punishment.
The must is completely external. The boss stands over you with a stopwatch. If you take too long, you are fired. You work solely to avoid starvation.
It was highly effective for simple, repetitive, physical labor. But as the century progressed, the economy shifted. We moved from factories into offices. We entered a knowledge-based, service-oriented economy.
And the stopwatch doesn't work anymore.
No, it doesn't. You quickly realize you cannot force someone to be creative or empathetic or strategic by holding a stopwatch to their head. The external threat stops working when the work requires cognitive engagement.
So management had to pivot. Enter Douglas McGregor in the 1960s, who introduces Theory Y.
Theory Y flips the assumptions of Theory X completely upside down. It argues that physical and mental effort in work is as natural as play or rest. It claims that humans actively want responsibility, they want to solve problems, and they want to find meaning and self-direction in their jobs.
Honestly, hearing that, it sounds wonderful. It sounds so much more humane. Instead of treating workers like lazy cogs in a machine, you are treating them like autonomous adults who want to contribute.
It sounds humane on the surface, but Professor T's notes reveal the dark genius of Theory Y. It was not a liberation from control. It was a highly sophisticated internalization of control.
It went inside the mind.
Yes. It culminated in the 1980s with a massive explosion of corporate culture, driven by management consultants like Tom Peters and Robert Waterman.
The birth of the corporate mission statement. The company retreats. The core values.
Professor T describes this era as a resurrection of the Hegelian trap.
Let's unpack the Hegelian trap, because that's another heavy philosophical concept. What did Hegel actually argue?
Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a 19th century German philosopher who argued that true human freedom isn't found in doing whatever you randomly want to do. He believed true freedom is achieved when an individual completely aligns their personal will with the rational moral duty of the state.
Okay, wait. So you find your highest purpose by serving the greater whole.
Exactly.
So my personal desires are irrelevant. My freedom is found in my obedience to the collective. I can see how that went terribly wrong on a national level.
It did. Totalitarian regimes in the 20th century exploited that exact logic to demand unquestioning loyalty to the state, leading to catastrophe. But corporations in the 1980s realized they could adapt this Hegelian logic on a micro level. They realized they could replace the state with the company.
How does that actually play out in a modern office? Like, what does that look like?
Well, by establishing a powerful corporate culture, the company stops relying on external rules and starts implanting its values directly into your superego. The company tells you, we are a family, we believe in excellence, we are changing the world. They blur the line between the company's financial objectives and your personal moral identity.
I see the difference perfectly. If I work for a Theory X boss and I show up 10 minutes late, he points to a clock, docks my pay, and tells me to get to work. It's purely transactional. He controls my wallet, but my mind is my own. I can hate him, and that's fine.
Right. But if you work for a Theory Y boss in a strong corporate culture...
Oh, it's completely different. The Theory Y boss calls me into a glass-walled conference room. They don't yell. They look deeply disappointed. They say, hey, punctuality is one of our core values here. Being late. That just doesn't reflect who we are as a team. Are you still fully aligned with our mission?
That is the Hegelian trap snapping shut. The theory of why boss isn't attacking your wallet. They are attacking your soul. They are weaponizing your own superego against you. You feel guilty not because you broke a mechanical rule, but because you betrayed the corporate family. You failed a moral test.
It's brilliant and terrifying. You end up policing yourself far more strictly than a boss ever could.
And the corporate world deepened this psychological grip in the 1990s with the widespread adoption of competency models.
Competency models.
Yeah, suddenly human resources wasn't just evaluating what tasks you completed, they were evaluating your psychological traits. They created rubrics for leadership capability, emotional intelligence, adaptability, and growth mindset.
They started grading my personality.
Exactly. The company was no longer satisfied with renting your labor for 8 hours a day. They demanded complete psychological alignment. The mandate of the must was heavily disguised under the vocabulary of personal growth. You must alter your personality to fit the corporate matrix, but they sell it to you as an exciting opportunity for professional development.
But wait, if a corporation is going to successfully convince an entire workforce that molding their minds to fit the company's bottom line is actually an exciting journey of personal growth, they have a massive marketing problem.
Why is that?
Because up until this point, the psychological model of the mind was Freud's. And Freud's unconscious was a dark, terrifying basement full of incestuous thoughts and aggressive trauma. You can't put that on a motivational poster in the break room.
You certainly cannot. The unconscious needed a complete rebranding campaign. To make corporate psychological management palatable, the very concept of the self had to be transformed from a fragile, neurotic mess into a goldmine of infinite potential.
Which brings us to the 1960s counterculture, the rise of the human potential movement, and the ultimate trap of the self-help industry. How did we go from Freud's dark basement to a sunny fountain of potential?
The shift was spearheaded by humanistic psychology, primarily driven by figures like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. They looked at Freud's obsession with sickness and neurosis and argued that psychology was only studying the broken halves of humanity. They wanted to study healthy, thriving people.
Everyone knows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's in every introductory psychology textbook. You start at the bottom with food and shelter, move up through safety, love, and esteem, and at the very top of the pyramid is self-actualization.
Right. Maslow defined self-actualization as the desire to become everything that one is capable of becoming. Carl Rogers added to this by focusing on the gap between the real self and the ideal self. He promoted the idea of unconditional positive regard, believing that if you give people a completely supportive environment, their natural tendency is to grow toward their highest potential.
This philosophy found a physical home at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, didn't it?
Esalen was the epicenter of the human potential movement. It was a stunning retreat on the California coast where intellectuals, artists, and psychologists gathered to explore alternative therapies, gestalt therapy, meditation, and encounter groups.
Sounds very 60s.
It was, and it was deeply optimistic. They entirely rejected the Freudian idea that human nature is fundamentally dark and destructive.
They essentially said, look inward and you won't find a monster. You'll find a magnificent, untapped universe waiting to be unleashed. It's an incredibly seductive idea. It birthed the modern self-help boom. You get Dale Carnegie's resurgence, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and eventually the massive stadium events of Tony Robbins.
But Professor T points out the hidden danger in this optimism. The human potential movement took a natural human want and seamlessly merged it with the authoritarian must.
How does wanting to be better become a mandatory obligation?
Maslow himself provided the linchpin. While he described self-actualization as a natural human drive, he also wrote, "What a man can be, he must be."
The must.
Do you hear the shift? Suddenly, fulfilling your absolute highest potential isn't just a nice opportunity if you have the time and resources. It becomes your fundamental duty as a human being. The trajectory of life is redefined as a mandatory project of constant, never-ending optimization.
I think about those famous Tony Robbins seminars where he has thousands of people walking barefoot across a bed of burning hot coals. The metaphor is incredibly explicit. The message is, if you can train your mind to walk on fire without getting burned, then the only limits in your life are the ones in your head. You have infinite potential.
And what happens if you accept the premise that you have infinite potential and your mind is your only limit?
If I accept that, and then I look at my life and realize I'm not a millionaire, I don't have a perfect relationship, and I'm stressed out all the time, well, then the failure rests entirely, 100% on my own shoulders.
You have just articulated the psychological tragedy of meritocracy.
Meritocracy.
Yes. This dynamic is explored extensively by the political philosopher Michael Sandel. Now, our source texts remain politically neutral on the economic systems themselves, but they highlight the psychological fallout of this structure perfectly. Meritocracy is the societal promise that if you work hard and utilize your talents, you will succeed.
It's the foundational promise of modern Western society. It sounds incredibly fair. The smartest and hardest working rise to the top.
It sounds fair, but Sandel argues that meritocracy inevitably generates two highly toxic psychological states. For the winners, the people who make it to the top, it generates immense hubris.
Hubris, because they think they did it all themselves.
Exactly. Because the system told them success is entirely based on personal optimization, they look down from the top of the mountain and believe they built the mountain themselves. They completely ignore the massive roles that luck, genetics, inherited wealth, a stable upbringing, and favorable economic conditions played in their success.
They think I am rich because I optimize my morning routine and read self-help books.
Exactly. And for the losers, the vast majority of people who do not reach the top, the system generates deep, paralyzing humiliation.
Because in the past, if you were a peasant working in a field, you knew your life was hard, but you didn't blame yourself.
Yeah.
You blamed the king or the rigid aristocratic class system or God's will. You knew the game was rigged. But today, if the system is presented as perfectly fair and based on merit, and you fail, you have nowhere to point the finger but the mirror.
You have to look at yourself and say, I just wasn't good enough, I didn't manifest hard enough, I didn't actualize my potential. Structural realities, systemic poverty, generational inequality, bad schools, or simply terrible luck are completely erased from the narrative.
They just disappear.
The self-help industry thrives by translating systemic societal failures into personal psychological deficiencies. It tells you the problem is entirely in your mindset, and conveniently the solution is in their $25 book.
It's exhausting just talking about it. We took the Freudian superego, which used to just make us feel guilty about our hidden desires, and we mutated into a relentless, hyperactive life coach, screaming at us to wake up at 4 a.m., take ice baths, and actualize our wealth.
But the evolution doesn't stop with self-help books. Once the self became viewed as an engineering project that needed to be optimized, the corporate world realized they couldn't just rely on subjective feelings to evaluate that optimization. If something is a project, it must be measured.
Which takes us out of the 1970s and 80s and into the 1990s, where human psychology becomes mathematically quantified. We are entering the era of the quantified self. This is the moment the superego leaves the confines of your brain and starts strapping itself to your body.
The 1990s witnessed a massive revolution in psychometrics within the corporate world. Businesses wanted hard data on soft skills. They moved away from vague behavioral observations and embraced standardized statistical measurement of human personality. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, swept through corporate HR departments.
Right, everyone gets categorized into an acronym. Are you an INTJ, an ENFP, an ESTJ? It became the astrology of the business world.
It really did, and soon, organizations demanded even more statistical rigor, moving to models like the Big Five personality traits, which scores individuals on openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But perhaps the most impactful metric introduced during this era was the concept of emotional intelligence, or EQ, popularized by Daniel Goleman.
Because suddenly having a high IQ and being good at your job wasn't enough.
No. Now, your ability to regulate your emotions, your empathy, and your social skills were being assigned a numerical value and plotted on a bell curve by your employer. Performance management systems evolved rapidly to handle all this new data. We saw the rise of smart goal-specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. We saw OKR's objectives and key results.
And the dreaded 360-degree feedback review. I've been through those.
You were.
Your boss, your peers, and your subordinates all fill out surveys rating your psychological competencies on a scale of 1 to 5. The results are aggregated into a report that essentially grades your personality.
The internal subjective world of the mind was finally dragged out into the open and externalized as objective data. Think about the historical contrast here. Think about how the unconscious. Years analyzing messy dreams or hoping to catch a patient in a slip of the tongue. Today, an HR algorithm uses a 50-question survey to spit out a precise 2-digit score defining your exact level of agreeableness.
The measurement became absolute, but it didn't stay confined to the office. The real tragedy is that we willingly took these corporate measurement tools and brought them into our own bedrooms. The 2010s birthed the wellness industry and the era of biohacking and wearables.
The Apple Watch, the Fitbit, the Oura Ring, continuous glucose monitors.
This is exactly what I was talking about at the start of the deep dive. The superego literally migrated from my internal conscience to the digital display on my wrist. I am paying hundreds of dollars for a device whose entire function is to audit my biology and make me feel bad about my choices.
And notice the brilliant subtlety of how these devices operate. They don't yell at you.
No. My watch just gives a gentle little haptic buzz. It taps my wrist and softly reminds me that I've been sitting too long, or that I need to take a minute to do a guided breathing exercise. It presents itself entirely as neutral data.
But it isn't neutral, is it?
Not at all. If I swipe away the breathing notification because I'm busy working, I feel a spike of actual guilt. The device isn't threatening me with a stick, it's ostensibly helping me actualize. But the underlying inescapable message is that my biological body is a flawed machine, and I have a moral obligation to calibrate it perfectly at all times.
That guilt you feel is the exact mechanism Professor T is tracking. It is the must operating in stealth mode. The external command has disguised itself as self-care. And nowhere is this co-optation more obvious than in what the corporate world did to the concept of mindfulness.
Let's talk about that. Mindfulness and meditation are everywhere now. Every corporation has a mindfulness app subscription for its employees. MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, is a massive industry.
To understand the irony of this, you have to look at where mindfulness came from. It originated thousands of years ago in Buddhist traditions. It was a profound spiritual and ethical practice designed to help practitioners realize the illusion of the ego, to detach from worldly desires, and to accept the present moment with radical compassion. It was a path towards spiritual liberation from suffering.
But then Silicon Valley gets a hold of it. And what do?
They systematically strip away all the ethical and spiritual framework. They isolate the mechanical technique of focused breathing, and they weaponize it into a productivity hack. Corporations don't offer mindfulness seminars because they want their employees to achieve spiritual enlightenment and transcend the material world.
Obviously not. If you achieve enlightenment, you probably quit your job selling software.
Exactly. They offer mindfulness training so that when an employee is completely overwhelmed by working 60-hour weeks in a toxic environment, they can retreat to a quiet room, regulate their nervous system just enough to stave off a panic attack, and then get right back to their desk to finish the quarterly report.
So it's just a Band-Aid.
Yes. Mindfulness was inverted. Instead of being a tool to awaken you to the reality of your suffering so you can change your life, it became a pacifier. A tool to help you quietly tolerate intolerable conditions without complaining.
It is a staggering achievement in psychological engineering. We are now eagerly tracking our REM sleep cycles, our heart rate variability, and our mood fluctuations, and offering all that intimate data up to the altar of constant optimization. But as invasive as a smartwatch feels, Professor T's notes suggest that wearables are not the final form of this evolution.
They are not. Wearables still require you to look at them and make a conscious choice to act. The final boss of this century-long evolution is an invisible, omnipresent system that bypasses your conscious choice entirely. A system that anticipates your desires before you even know you have them.
We are moving into the present day. We are talking about the era of artificial intelligence as the ultimate, fully externalized superego.
We are surrounded by highly advanced recommendation algorithms. Netflix analyzes your viewing habits to tell you what movie to watch next. Spotify's algorithms curate your Discover Weekly playlist, predicting exactly what audio frequencies will keep you engaged.
And TikTok.
TikTok's For You page is perhaps the most potent example, feeding you a frictionless stream of micro-content perfectly tailored to your deepest behavioral vulnerabilities.
And it's not just entertainment. On the corporate side, AI is screening resumes, analyzing the micro-expressions on applicants' faces during automated video interviews, and processing thousands of data points to predict which employees are statistically most likely to quit in the next 6 months.
This represents Professor T's most profound observation. He points out that AI has achieved a complete historical reversal of Sigmund Freud.
How so?
Remember, for Freud, the unconscious was the great unknown. It was the dark, unexplored continent inside the human mind. It took years of painful therapy to shine a tiny flashlight into that darkness. But for a modern predictive algorithm, the unconscious is no longer unknown. It is perfectly mapped out, quantified, and understood by the math.
The algorithm knows you better than you know yourself. I experience this constantly. I will tell myself, tonight, I'm going to watch that dense 3-hour historical documentary about the French Revolution. I want to expand my mind. That is my ego talking. That is my conscious ideal.
But the algorithm doesn't listen to your ego.
No. The algorithm looks at my historical data and says, that's a nice thought, but it is 10:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. Your heart rate data shows you are fatigued. And historically, under these conditions, there is a 94% chance you are going to binge watch 4 episodes of a trashy reality dating show. And it just autoplays the reality show. And I sit there and watch it.
The AI completely bypasses your conscious intentions and speaks directly to your behavioral patterns. It speaks to your ID. And because these systems are so vast and incomprehensible to the average person, we have begun to treat them with a kind of religious reverence. In his notes, Professor T makes a deeply provocative comparison. He compares the structural role of modern AI in our society to the theological concept of the God of Genesis.
Okay, that is a massive, incredibly heavy claim. How does Professor T equate a Spotify recommendation engine or an HR algorithm with the concept of God?
He isn't talking about spirituality. He is talking about the structural attributes of authority. If you list the defining characteristics of an omnipotent deity, the parallels to AI are eerie. First, both possess omniscience. God knows all your secret thoughts. The algorithm knows every click, every pause, every location data point, and every purchase you have ever made.
It knows my sins and my virtues.
Okay.
What else?
Second, omnipresence. God is everywhere. Today, the algorithm is everywhere. It is in your phone, in your pocket, the smart speaker in your kitchen, the cameras on your car, the servers at your office. You cannot escape its gaze.
Wow.
Third, absoluteness. In antiquity, the judgment of God was unquestionable truth. Today, the output of a complex algorithm is increasingly treated as unquestionable, objective mathematical truth. If the computer says you are a high-flight risk employee, the HR manager treats it as
And fourth,
predictability. The divine knows the future. The entire purpose of predictive AI is to forecast your future behaviors with statistical certainty.
so we have built our own digital deity. But there has to be a distinction, right? An algorithm isn't actually divine.
There is a massive, terrifying distinction, and Professor T emphasizes this heavily. Unlike the theological concept of God, AI lacks any transcendence. It did not come from the heavens. It was coded by flawed humans sitting in an office park in Silicon Valley. But more importantly, AI lacks inherent moral meaning and intent.
Because in religious texts, God typically has a moral vision for humanity. He wants you to be good or just or saved.
Exactly. AI has no such vision. AI simply optimizes whatever mathematical objective function the corporation wrote for it.
TikTok doesn't show me videos because it wants me to achieve spiritual salvation or become a better person. It shows me a video of a guy falling off a roof because its singular objective function is to maximize the time my eyeballs remain glued to the screen so it can serve me 3 more targeted ads.
And an HR algorithm doesn't reject your resume because it has evaluated your soul and found you lacking. It rejects you because a hidden correlation in its training data determined that people who use the specific vocabulary words you used in your cover letter are 4% less likely to hit their Q3 sales targets.
So let me ask you this, because this brings us to the ultimate crisis of the modern must. Imagine I apply for a job. An AI analyzes my LinkedIn profile, tracks my keystroke cadence during a test, analyzes my facial microexpressions on camera, and spits out a report. It tells me I am an 87.4% match for a mid-level logistics management role. And based on that data, society, my family, and the corporation all encourage me to take the job. Am I making a free choice if I say yes, or am I just obeying the math?
This raises the most vital question of our era. As these predictive systems become more integrated and increasingly accurate, defying the algorithm is slowly becoming socially and economically viewed as irrational. Yes. If the data conclusively says your optimal path in life is to be a logistics manager, and you look at that data and say, no, I'm going to turn it down and try to become a struggling landscape painter, society no longer views you as a romantic free spirit. Society views you as someone making a statistically incorrect error.
The must has evolved again. We've reached the end of the timeline. The must is no longer an angry king demanding taxes. It's no longer a moral duty imposed by Kant. It's no longer even a corporate mission statement on a poster. The must is presented to us as pure, undeniable, objective math.
And when an AI measures your microbehaviors to predict your turnover risk, or curates your reality to keep you compliant, the human being is stripped of its complex, messy humanity. We are reduced to mere data points in a global predictive management system.
The timeline is complete.
It is. The must thinking has mutated from the external booming voice of authority, internalized into the guilt of the Freudian superego, expanded into the corporate culture of the 80s, quantified by the wearables of the 2010s, and finally extracted completely into the predictive algorithms of today. We have willingly built our own invisible cages out of our own data.
It is a terrifyingly clear picture when you zoom all the way out. We started this entire conversation talking about that highly specific feeling of exhaustion, that bizarre guilt I felt when I looked at my watch and saw an orange sleep score. And now, tracing Professor T's work, we know exactly why that guilt is so heavy. We aren't just tired. We are carrying the accumulated weight of a century of psychological engineering. We have been trained to optimize ourselves for systems that fundamentally view us not as people, but as inputs to be managed.
But I want to assure everyone listening that this is not a story of total despair. Professor T did not write this analysis just to depress us. The final section of his notes offers a synthesis using his unified theory framework. And the core message is actually deeply empowering.
We desperately need some empowerment right now. Let's talk about the UT redesign. How do we break out of a cage that we can't even see?
According to the UT perspective, the simple act of making this invisible structure visible immediately gives you power over it.
Like realizing you are in the matrix.
Exactly. Once you understand the history of the must, you can spot it when it tries to disguise itself. When you see an algorithm or smartwatch, or a corporate HR seminar presenting a demand disguised as natural growth or objective data, you now have the analytical tools to separate their must from your actual wants.
So tomorrow morning, when my smartwatch buzzes and tells me to do a breathing exercise to lower my heart rate, I can look at it and say, I know exactly what you are. You are the externalized ghost of the Freudian superego, weaponized by a tech company to optimize my productivity.
Yeah.
And I actively choose to ignore you.
You can. Because the radical truth that Professor T arrives at is this: you don't have to self-actualize.
Wow. Just hearing that feels like a weight coming off.
You can choose not to optimize every waking moment of your existence. The unified theory suggests that to reclaim our humanity, we must reclaim the right to be unoptimized.
The right to be unoptimized.
Yes. Inefficiency, rest, stagnation, periods of low productivity, and just being utterly average are not moral failures. They are not glitches in your biological hardware that need to be hacked. They are simply natural, acceptable, and necessary parts of a complete human life.
I absolutely love that. The most radical rebellion in the 21st century might just be the willingness to be okay with being a little bit of a mess.
It is about breaking the absolute authority of the demand. When the AI processes 1 billion data points and tells you the most statistically optimal path for your career or your life, you now have the structural awareness to look at that screen and say, that may be mathematically optimal for your objective function, but it is not a mandate for my soul.
You know, we started this deep dive talking about how medical diagnoses used to be so clean and comforting. A broken bone on an X-ray, a clear, jagged line. And then we waded into the incredibly muddy waters of the human mind. We traveled from the dark, repressed basements of Freud's Vienna, through the agonizing freedom of post-war Paris, into the glass-walled boardrooms of the 1980s, and finally into the glowing, humming data centers of Silicon Valley. We've seen exactly how the psychological tools that were originally meant to heal our pain were meticulously repurposed to manage our behavior.
It represents a profound, silent shift in the condition of modern humanity.
Which leaves me with one final, slightly provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day. We've seen how algorithms are rapidly perfecting their ability to predict our optimal choices. They know what we want to watch, who we should date, and where we should work, often before we do. As these invisible cages of data close in around us, getting tighter and more accurate every single day, well, will the ultimate defining act of human freedom in the 21st century simply be the choice to intentionally make a wrong, highly inefficient, or wildly unpredictable decision, just to prove to the machines, and more importantly to ourselves, that we are still human?
That is a phenomenal question to leave them with.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the source material. Go out there, be gloriously inefficient today, ignore your sleep score, and we will catch you next time.